finally decided what you wanted to do for a career. A younger you chasing those big dreams, whether it be moving to the city, following in your parents' footsteps, or doing something completely different. The experience of seeking employment when young is different for everyone, and that's because of a range of different things. So let's talk about that and where we're at in a time that's been really hard for employment, no matter your age. Dr. David Farrugia has been taking a closer look at all the factors that are impacting today's youth. Good morning, David.
Good morning.
Has the labour market always been hard for young people?
Well, it depends how far back in history you want to look. Young people nowadays really do bear the brunt of economic changes. But there was a period of time closely following the Second World War in which young people from all socio-economic backgrounds could be reasonably confident that they would move from school into work in a fairly stable manner. And the pathways that were available to them were fairly clear. They tended to closely resemble the kind of pathways that their parents had followed, and their parents were able to provide them with some fairly clear advice about what it would mean to become a worker and move into work. But since then, things have changed dramatically, and elevated levels of youth unemployment are now basically a structural feature of the contemporary economy, and this is the case, across the world. And there's also an extremely high level of insecurity and precarity in the youth labour market in general. We have an increasingly insecure labour market across the board, but young people really do bear the brunt of that. So the basic situation for young people now is of enormous uncertainty, and the kind of differences in young people's pathways into work are kind of forged within that context of structural precariousness.
What about people who say that the youth just don't want to work as hard as previous youth?
Well, a lot of people do say that. I guess the short answer to that question is that is just wrong. I've been conducting research with young people for many years now, and I have never encountered any evidence of that. And there is no evidence that young people don't want to work. And in fact, the case is rather the opposite. We're in a situation now in which people's sense of self and their sense of self-worth is actually really, really tied up in work. And I've been doing research with young people who are in the early stages of becoming workers, or who are thinking about what they're going to do in terms of work in their futures. And what I've found is that there's an increasing disjuncture between the opportunities that are available to young people and their personal investments in work. So on the one hand, we've got a youth labour market which is increasingly precarious and uncertain, and with very high levels of youth unemployment. But on the other hand, what I find when I talk to young people is that they're making enormous personal investments in work as an area in their life and as an aspect of their sense of self. And in fact, what young people are searching for is for a work situation which will allow them to, in a sense, realise themselves. A work situation which they see as an opportunity to develop aspects of their identity. So what's actually happening is that, on the one hand, the labour market is becoming an increasingly difficult space to negotiate for young people. But on the other hand, young people are responding to that by doubling down on work, and are actually viewing work as an area of life that goes way beyond just the necessity to have money to pay for your expenses. They're viewing work as an area in which they can realise themselves and in which they can develop their own identities. And this is a real kind of paradox, which is that as work becomes more uncertain, young people's investment in work is actually increasing. And there's a whole range of reasons for that. But young people are bombarded with messages from the early days of school that the purpose of everything that they do as young people is to become workers. There's a whole apparatus that surrounds young people to kind of encourage them to think about what it means to work and to make work into a really central part of their identity. And it's very successful. Young people are enormously invested in work.
Yeah, and I think that we can all know that we tie our parts of our identity is tied in with the job we do. Well, whenever you meet new people, it's one of the first questions that is asked. Oh, what do you do for work? So what do we know about that link, especially as we're young and going out into the world and trying to work out where we fit and who we are and what we like? How do we see work play such an important role in discovering our identities?
Well, that's a great question. Young people respond to that kind of imperative in a range of different ways. So one of the biggest findings about that comes out of my research recently is there are differences in terms of young people's socioeconomic backgrounds, in terms of how they respond to this necessity to become a worker. So one really prevalent trend is that you might have young people from working class backgrounds, and they talk about work in terms of the necessity of having a strong work ethic. The idea here is that you work hard, you commit yourself to work, and you do the kind of work that you're going to be good at. You find some aspect of yourself that can become a skill on the labour market, you dedicate yourself to honing that skill, and then hopefully you'll get a job that capitalises on that skill, and you'll have a whole range of markers of material success as a result of that. So hopefully you're able to buy a house, a nice car, those kinds of things. And that's your kind of traditional work ethic. Then there are young people who might come from more affluent backgrounds, and the way they tend to talk about work is really much more about realising their intrinsic passions. So rather than finding a skill that they happen to be good at, they approach work in terms of investing their full personal passions into their jobs and in life in general. So they don't see work as a separate part of their life at all. They just want to be people, high energy and passionate people whose passions are realised across all of their lives, including work. But what unites young people across that socio-economic spectrum is the centrality of work for their idea of themselves in general. And we as a society have come to the point where people see their own personal value in terms of their value to the labour market. It's a very profound connection.
We always see a little bit of generational debate, as we were saying a little earlier, and that has been sparked again thanks to the budget, with older people feeling like there's not much help for them getting into the workforce, or getting back into the workforce, or having that support. But we've seen a newly unveiled job maker hiring credit, which will give $200 a week to employers who hire anyone aged 16 to 30, $100 for workers 30 to 35. The government's saying it will create 450,000 jobs for young people and will be available for businesses for up to a year. Is something like this a helpful way to address youth unemployment in your mind, David?
I think that it's good to offer young people a place in the labour market and to offer them a place in work, because work is such a key part of our lives. I would note that this is not a policy that produces jobs per se. It's a policy that subsidises employers for hiring people, regardless of what they do with their staff. But I think actually more broadly that economic crises like this are an opportunity for a new conversation about the meaning of work in our societies, actually. Because do we want to live in a society in which our personal value is tied up entirely with work? Is work really the be-all and end-all of life in the way that young people are really encouraged to think of it as? So, of course, youth unemployment is an enormous problem, and young people certainly have better lives when they have good, secure jobs. But we also know, especially as we get a little bit later in our lives, we also know that work is not all that. Even those of us who are lucky enough to have really nice jobs don't necessarily want to spend all of our time working. And we also know from the evidence that people who are young in their early stages of their careers or their working lives report that they want to spend more time at work and they want to invest themselves in work more. However, what the evidence shows is that when people get to their mid-30s, they start to report that they'd like to be working less. They'd like to pull back on work a little bit. And I think what happens at that point in life is that new priorities emerge, people start to have families, and people also start to realise that no matter how nice their job is, it's not much of a life when work is the be-all and end-all of your existence. So I think that these changing priorities and the very turbulent economic context that we find ourselves in need to be the opportunity for a new kind of conversation about work, where we start to reflect as a society on what the purpose of work is in our lives and where else can we be investing ourselves in to try to live happy and fulfilling lives.
Interesting to start that conversation with you this morning. Thank you, David.
Thank you so much.
Dr. David Farrugia there, Senior Lecturer and Sociologist at the University of Newcastle.